One of the most important technical pieces to master in photography is exposure. Exposure refers to how light or dark your overall image is. As a photographer, you get to control how much light enters your camera. If you let in too much light, your photo will be too bright or overexposed. But if you don't let in enough, it'll be too dark or underexposed. Your exposure is determined by three settings: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Each setting has its own purpose, but their relationship to one another determines your overall exposure. Finding the right balance is all about understanding what each one does, how it affects the others, and how you can use it to create your ideal image. In this video, we're going to teach you everything you need to know about exposure. So let's get right into it. Okay, so let's start with aperture. Think of the aperture as a hole in your lens that functions much like the pupil of your eye. When it's dark, you open it wider to let in more light, and when it's bright, you make it smaller to let in less light. Aperture is measured in f-stops. With the smaller the f-stop number, the wider the aperture, and the bigger the f-stop number, the smaller the aperture. But aperture doesn't just control how much light enters your camera. It also determines the depth of field in your image, which is how much of your subject is in focus compared to the background. A shallow depth of field allows you to throw the background of your image out of focus, drawing focus to your subject. To achieve a shallow depth of field, use a wide aperture or a low f-stop. On the other hand, a deep depth of field is ideal for landscape photography, where everything from the foreground to the background needs to be in focus. Using a narrow aperture or a high f-stop will help everything to be in focus. Okay, so next up is shutter speed, which determines how long light is allowed to pass through to your sensor. A slower shutter speed lets in more light, while a faster shutter speed lets in less light. Darker shooting conditions requires a slower shutter speed, such as 1/60th, to let in enough light to fill in the scene. You need much less light in brighter conditions, so you should use a faster shutter speed, such as 1/500th of a second. More than controlling how long light is allowed to enter your camera, shutter speed can capture movement in two distinctive ways. Slow shutter speeds blur movement, while fast shutter speeds freeze movement. When shooting in shutter priority mode, your aperture will change as you change your shutter speed. Using a slow shutter speed such as 1/60th of a second, your camera will select a narrower aperture to compensate for how long light enters the lens. By choosing a fast shutter speed, such as 1/500th, your camera will select a wider aperture. Finally, ISO controls your camera's sensitivity to light. In dark situations, you can increase the sensitivity by raising your ISO, while in bright conditions, you can decrease it by lowering your ISO. A general rule of thumb for determining which ISO to use is, an ISO of 400 is perfect for an overcast day. Whether your scene is brighter or darker than an overcast day will help you to decide if you should use a lower or higher ISO. In darker conditions where you need to use a higher ISO, you may run the risk of introducing visual noise into your image. Now, depending on your camera, you may begin to see signs of noise when shooting an ISO of 800 or higher. Digital noise is a type of visual distortion. It looks similar to grain found in film images, but it can also look like discolored splotches in severe cases. If it's bad enough, it can ruin your entire photo. When setting up your shot, you should always set your ISO first. Your ISO will affect what apertures and shutter speeds you can use. So which shooting mode should you use? While scene modes and auto mode may seem tempting, they don't allow for creativity and can produce poor images. Manual mode gives you complete control of all of your settings. Your camera will do none of the work for you. You might have heard that a lot of people say that you might have to shoot in manual mode to be considered a professional, but this is simply not true. As a beginner, manual mode can be a source of great anxiety. Even many professionals choose to shoot in aperture or shutter priority mode, as it allows them to get their settings right faster in the field when they may not have the time to adjust each one individually. Program, aperture priority, or shutter priority are the only modes you really need when you're first starting out. They allow you to get the most critical settings while the camera sorts out the rest. This is super helpful while you're learning, as you don't have to waste time trying to figure out all of the settings yourself and potentially miss your shot. Program mode allows you to set your ISO while your camera determines the scene's ideal aperture and shutter speed. If you know what aperture you want to use, aperture priority lets you set your aperture and ISO, and your camera selects the appropriate shutter speed. The concept is the same for shutter priority. But what if you want to intentionally over or underexpose your images? That's where exposure compensation comes in, allowing you to manipulate the overall exposure of your entire image by making it brighter or darker. Now, exposure compensation can only be used in aperture priority, shutter priority, or program mode. It doesn't work in manual or auto mode, as full control of the camera settings is entirely up to you or the camera. You might wonder why you'd ever want to intentionally over or underexpose your images, but it's often a much more common necessity than you'd think. If you photograph something bright like snow, it may look sort of gray or underexposed, and if you photograph something dark, like the inside of a bar, it may look too overexposed. This can ruin the image's overall atmosphere, but you can combat this with exposure compensation. Okay, so there you have it. Everything you need to know about exposure in photography. Whether you're a beginner or a pro, understanding exposure is critical to capturing your ideal image. If you're interested, click the link in the description below to learn more about exposure. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.